Hello, my name is Luis Mundaca, and in this short lecture, I will talk about economic instruments for encouraging the transition towards a green economy. Economic instruments, also called market-based instruments, are widely used to solve environmental-related issues. This group of policy instruments works through price mechanisms and market signals that attempt to change the economic conditions and behavior of a given group of actors in our society. These instruments provide economic incentives to consumers and industry to reduce their environmental footprint efficiently, and also encourage technological innovation more compatible with the environment. So, how do they work? The main foundation of economic instrument is that markets and prices can be powerful tools to work in favor of the environment. With economic instruments, we recognize that markets need to be fixed or even need to be created in order to solve environmental problems. To do so, economic instruments confront producers and consumers with the same incentives they face in everyday markets, that is, prices. Prices that convey information and send incentives to economize and make efficient use of resources. Prices that can better reflect the true socioeconomic cost of production and consumption. Economic instruments work under the idea that if incorrect price signals are sent, markets are incapable of maintaining given levels of environmental quality or providing public goods, such as fisheries or open space. In economics, this idea is often summarized as a market failure, and the environment is often taken as the main source to explain why the market does not provide a remedy for all economic problems. Let us use cars as an example and ask ourselves, what kind of economic incentives can we implement to make eco-friendly cars more attractive for buyers? And what kind of disincentives can be introduced to make conventional cars less attractive? Using economic instruments, we can provide incentives to producers for reducing the negative externalities related to conventional cars, such as the release of CO2 emissions. At the same time, we can use economic instruments to provide incentives to consumers to put a higher value on the positive externalities associated to eco-friendly cars, like low or zero emissions. For the purpose of this lecture, I suggest 5 main categories of economic instruments, namely environmental taxes and charges, deposit and refund schemes, environmentally driven subsidies or payments, liability rules and compensation schemes, and tradable permits or tradable certificate schemes. Let's start with the first category. Here, a tax or charge is levied on the amount of pollution that producers or consumers generate and the estimated damage caused by their pollution emission. In Scandinavia, there are multiple applications of environmental taxes and charges, for instance, in wastewater, municipal solid waste, and traffic congestion. To tackle congestion in Stockholm and improve the environmental situation in the city center, a congestion charge was introduced in 2007. And in Sweden, there is also a road tax for new cars based on their weight and the amount of CO2 emissions they emit. Cars that are considered eco-friendly, often compact cars running on ethanol or electricity that emit less than 100 grams of CO2 per driven kilometer, do not pay this tax at all. With these economic incentives in place, drivers have incentive to use public transportation instead or buy eco-friendly cars. And to tackle global warming, Sweden has implemented some of the highest CO2 taxes in the world, more than 100 euros per ton of CO2. These instruments also raise revenues that can be used to offset taxes on labor and capital, fund and support implementation of abatement measures like a wastewater treatment plant, or be a financing source for other economic instruments such as subsidies for clean technologies or public transportation. Let's continue to deposit and refund schemes, which is a combination of a charge with a rebate. In this case, consumers are asked to pay a charge when purchasing potentially polluting products and obtain a refund when returning the product to an approved center for recycling or disposal. A key goal of a deposit and refund scheme is to provide incentives to prevent the improper or illegal disposal of polluting products such as lead-acid batteries, electronics, or beverage containers. For example, Norway has a mandatory deposit refund system for card hulks. You pay approximately 300 euros when buying a new card and get around 350 euros back when you return an old card to an authorized scrap business. This scheme gives incentives for the reuse, recycling, and proper disposal of vehicle parts. Environmentally driven subsidies or payment is a payment by the government to consumers or producers in order to stimulate the development and implementation of environmental friendly technologies, like wind turbines or solar PV, or even the provision of ecosystem services, like biodiversity conservation. In fact, payment for ecosystem services can also be considered within this category. This specific economic approach works under the premise that those who provide environmental services, like farmers or landowners managing their land for climate change mitigation, should be compensated for doing so, and those who receive the benefits of these services should also pay for their provision. There are numerous applications of environmentally driven subsidies and payments in Scandinavia. Applications range from financial support for research and development to the specific implementation of energy efficiency technologies such as triple glaze windows or subsidies for eco-friendly cars. This category also includes the removal of subsidies, so-called perverse or environmentally harmful subsidies. In this area, growing attention has been paid lately to the removal of subsidies that support the use of fossil fuels due to concerns about the negative effects of climate change. Next, liability rules and compensation schemes provide incentives to producers to prevent or take into consideration the potential environmental damages that can result from their activities, such as oil production or mining. Liability rules and compensation schemes aim at preventing environmental damages, restoring environmental quality, and safeguarding sufficient compensation for damages resulting from dangerous activities. Applications range from contaminated land, the breach of standards, and oil spills. For example, there is liability of illegal disposal of cars in Sweden. It is a criminal offense and you can be convicted for environmental crime and even go to prison if the environment suffers. The fifth and final category is tradable permit schemes. Under this type of economic instruments, a given target is established by the authority and permits or certificates are allocated or auctioned among participants. This target can take the form of an overall level of pollution, for example for greenhouse gas emissions, or a given amount of renewable energy or energy savings. Firms that can meet the target at low cost have an economic incentive to sell their surplus of permits to other firms that find it expensive to meet their targets. Alternatively, firms that find it costly to meet their target are likely to buy permits from firms that can meet their targets inexpensively. For example, the owners of electric cars could sell their pollution permits to drivers of conventional cars. Users of conventional cars could buy these permits and continue driving, but they could also drive less in order to meet their emission target. The main idea with tradable permit schemes is to meet environmental targets in the most cost-effective way by giving incentives to actors for trading. So, now you have learned about 5 main types of economic instruments. In theory, it is expected that the introduction of economic instruments will help us to achieve a given policy goal at least possible cost. This is because economic instruments often provide greater decision power or flexibility to actors than regulatory instruments. For instance, with regulatory instruments like a technology standards, the choice belongs to the regulator. In this case, you, as a regulator, tell a company how much it is allowed to pollute and the technology to be used to achieve those limits. The consequence of this action is that very little flexibility is given to the polluter and thus forcing polluting companies to take on equal shares the burden of pollution control regardless the cost they face individually. In contrast, economic instruments provide incentives to reduce pollution, but they do not define the specific technologies to reduce pollution. This level of flexibility is given to the polluter. Let's assume that we introduce a tax on wastewater. On one hand, actors facing high costs to reduce their wastewater might choose to pay the tax. On the other hand, actors facing low costs to reduce their wastewater might choose to install abatement equipment. In this case, the tax aims to make the reduction of pollution more attractive to low-cost polluters than to high-cost polluters. This situation reduces the total cost of environmental compliance. However, it is important to say that in cases where abatement costs are similar for all polluters, regulatory instruments might be a better policy choice. In the last decades, we have witnessed a growing interest in and implementation of economic instruments for environmental protection. Our research shows that what is often required is a mix of ambitious policy instruments, including regulatory approaches and information programs, in order to change the behavior of producers and consumers. Despite notable success in certain areas, evidence shows that economic instruments are not the solution to all problems in environmental policy. There are numerous market and political barriers, including behavioral failures that need to be addressed. If we really want to move towards a green economy, we need a comprehensive and well-designed mix of ambitious policy instruments.